All right, welcome back. This is going to be lecture 4. Today we're going to be talking about electoral systems and economic policy. So we're going to jump straight into more of the democracy studies, um, again, because the vast majority of this sort of new field of political economy, new, it's 40 years old, but much more new than sort of economics or political science in general. Um, we just don't have a lot of data on autocracies. So while we can sort of theorize about them, it's really hard to test those theories. So we're going to jump into economic policies. We're going to talk more about democracies now. This one is by Torsten Persson and Guido Tabellini. And they basically want to talk about how electoral structures affect budgetary decisions and economic decisions. So we'll jump right into it, okay? Part 1 starts with electoral systems, motive, stability, and selection. Okay. And so their main argument, right, is that there is a trade off to be had in any electoral system that you build between accountability and representation. Okay. And their argument is that single member district systems, like the United States or like England, where only one person comes out of every district, and there are two parties in those systems. Those SMD systems, as we call them, or plurality, as we call them also, plurality systems lead to bigger swings in legislative majorities when the political sentiment changes. And so this generally means that legislators will have a larger incentive to please their voters. And so this should tend to lead to less corruption and less rent collection in the society, right? Um, However, while it does sort of incentivize representation in that way, um, it also sort of disincentivizes accountability in that it incentivizes giving benefits to a narrow constituency that gets you elected, right? You have to, in a PR system, um, with a larger district magnitude. District magnitude means the number of people that come from every district, right? And like I said, in the United States, it's two. In England, it's generally around two, 2.5, because they do have a little bit of a minority party. But in PR systems, proportional representation systems, you could have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties. Um, Especially if you look like a country, like Italy has a lot of parties. Um, Israel, especially because they have such a high district magnitude, it's basically 140 legislators from a single district, which is the entire country. They don't break it down into like counties or states or things like that. You have to earn the trust of the entire population to get elected in a place like that, right? And so you have more of an incentive to distribute government goods than you do in a single member district system like America. Um, okay, so we're going to jump in, and he wants to talk about the three ways in part 2 of the chapter. He wants to talk about the three electoral rules that we'll be talking about during the chapter, right? And so we'll be talking about electoral formulas, and this is basically just how do you translate votes into seats. So generally, this is PR versus single member district seats. You can sort of dichotomize it usually in the literature. Do we have proportional representation, where you take a percentage of the vote, say, you win 15%, and so your party gets approximately 15% of the seats? Or are you in a plurality district or a single member district where whoever the highest vote getter is takes the seat, and the only seat, right? And then we have district magnitude. So this reflects how many seats are in a typical district, right? And so in the US and England, it's going to be one. In Brazil, it's one, right? They have the same sort of SMD system that we have. Um, but in PR systems, they'll often have, say, 6 members can come from this district, 7 from that district, 12 from this district, sort of depending on the population size. And so you just need to garner, a proportion, percentage of the population to get a seat from your district, which has numerous. And like I said, this goes anywhere from, say 2 can win a seat in your district, to 140, as it is in the Knesset in Israel, where the entire country is the district. Um, and then we'll talk about sort of the ballot structure, right? Do you choose a candidate individually, as you do like in the United States and single member districts? Um, or do you have sort of an open party list where you can actually vote on um, an individual candidate in a PR system? Or do you have a closed party list, which a lot of PR systems do, where you vote only on a party and then the party chooses who to put into those individual seats, which sort of reduces accountability, right? Okay. So the first sort of nexus, right? We got accountability versus responsibility. Excuse me, representation. Accountability versus representation. So part 3 focuses on accountability, and we'll walk through that. So he first wants you to know that we're not really considering any highly distinct ideological issues. We're going to kind of think of we're going to kind of ignore the issues and just talk about how the electoral formulas sort of affect uh, accountability in a democracy. So there are both direct and indirect effects, and we'll talk about the direct effects first. So the electoral effect, the electoral formula, excuse me, has an effect, right? So accountability should be greater when you're voting for an individual candidate, right? I think that's pretty clear. Um, because you're just more able to sort of unelect them, right? You know who your candidate is going to be, who you're casting your vote on, and you can hold them more accountable in the future. Whereas when there's a closed party system and you're just voting on the political party, and then once the election results come out, the party chooses who to fill the seats with. It's really hard to hold them accountable in that kind of system, right? Um, you don't know who you're voting on, and you don't know what really, you hope you know what their policies are, but you don't even know if you can necessarily unelect them in the future, um, because say the party got 6 electors from your district and you don't like one of them. And so their percentage drops small, they get a small percentage drop in their next election. And, they're still going to get 5 of those seats, say, and the one you dislike still may be on the party list. So it reduces accountability. And when accountability is low, you tend to see higher levels of corruption, at least theoretically, right? Um, District magnitude is also important, right? The number of people that come out of a district. If you have tight elections, a single member district should have high accountability, um, because small swings in these single member districts can lead to big changes in the legislative majority or minority, as we see in the United States, where the Republicans right now have this super razor thin margin of like 2 votes in the House. Um, and they're having trouble sort of keeping their party in line. But single member districts should lead, at least when they're tight elections, should lead to more accountability. However, when you have single member districts have sort of, they lose their electoral viability, and you have these single member districts where one party is basically guaranteed the vote in many districts. That's when they start to lose accountability, and that's what you're really seeing in the United States right now, where gerrymandering has led to extraordinarily safe seats in like 90 to 95% of House of Representatives seats. Are very few um, sort of competitive seats left in the United States House of Representatives. And so, arguably, theoretically, we're losing accountability because of that. Um, and we're also seeing a whole lot more polarization, right? Because the only way you can lose an election right now in the United States House of Representatives is through being primaried. And you're seeing now that's causing candidates to become more and more extreme because they don't have to concern themselves with a general election, right? They just have to prove they're sort of the biggest crazy on the block. Um, and, I'm the most liberal cat out there, or I'm the most psycho Republican on the block. And so they can win their primary, and then their general election is guaranteed, right? And so we're sort of losing that sort of accountability, and we're also seeing extraordinary polarization in the US because of our primary systems and because of the combination of gerrymandering and primaries together. So it's kind of a scary ordeal. All right, but we'll move on to part 3.2. These are the indirect effects on accountability in a democracy, right? And so they suggest that first, there's an effect on honesty, right? And so their assumption is they build this tiny little model and they say it basically varies on two axes: honesty and ideology, right? You can have an honest or a dishonest politician, and then you can have a left or a right wing ideology, right? And voters always prefer an honest candidate, but they can differ on ideology. Okay. So, under a PR system where you have a high district magnitude and a lot of people are sort of getting elected from the same district, honest candidates always win out because there's always an honest candidate available on both sides of the ideology. And so you always get honest candidates regardless of ideology. However, under the single member district or plurality rule system, sometimes dishonest characters win out because you could have an honest or a dishonest right for both liberal or sort of Democratic or Republican, but a dishonest Republican or a dishonest liberal can win in their primary and then win in a general election because there's only one seat, right? And so many times you'll get a dishonest um, politician who wins out because of the ideological spectrum. So it's a little concerning in single member district systems. Um, on the other hand, PR and high district magnitude systems tend to lead to what's called coalition building. They don't have, in a two party system, right? One party always has a majority, just mathematically. However, in PR systems where, say, you know, in, I don't know, let's say Switzerland, okay? You'll have three parties on the left. You'll have a Green Party, a center left party, maybe a socialist party, and then you'll have like on the right, you'll have a center right party, and then you'll have like a maybe a neo Nazi party. We're seeing a lot of that in Europe right now on the rise. Um, and so you'll have like six or seven different parties all vying for control. None of them have a 50% of the legislature, right? And so they have to build a coalition between parties to create a government, right? They need to come up with 50% plus one legislators in some sort of coalition. But the problem here is that it's really hard to hold a coalition accountable, right? You don't know who's in charge of making the policy. You don't know which one of your legislators and which party they are in are purporting to support which policy, which ones. It's really difficult. Whereas in a Republican versus Democrat, it's like, okay, the Republicans are doing that, right? They're putting in that policy, they signed the bill. But when there's four or five parties, like there are in, say, Israel or Switzerland or places like that, it's a lot more difficult to hold one party responsible or one candidate responsible, right? And so there's a lot less accountability in those systems. Now, what do the statistics say, right? We've been talking about sort of logic and assumption model building. The statistics say that single member districts actually tend to cut taxes and reduce spending in election years, suggesting that they have more accountability than PR systems. And the statistics tend to say, on average, that plurality or SMD systems reduce taxes by about 0.5% compared to PR systems in an election year, and PR systems do not. However, in the summary, they also say that there's very little difference, that there's any statistical evidence that there is a difference between sort of PR or high electoral district systems and SMD or plurality systems on a range of variables measuring corruption. So it's really hard to say that this accountability side that he's talking about actually holds up to real world examination. Okay. All right. So we'll move on to sort of his second axis, which is representation. All right. And he says again, the way that your electoral system is built, again, has both direct and indirect effects on representation in your democratic society. So the first one we'll focus on is the direct effects on the composition of government spending. Okay, and so what we tend to find statistically and what we find logically is that single member districts, the two-party systems, tend to lead to a much narrower distribution of benefits. They tend to benefit the wealthy, and they tend to benefit sort of specifically the people that vote for them and donate to them. Whereas PR has to be a lot more broad, right? They have to sort of encapsulate a much more broad spectrum of government spending or government benefits because they have a much larger population that they have to please. Um, and so PR and high district magnitude countries um, tend to have to attract larger portions of their society. And so this tends to make their programs a lot more redistributive, excuse me, a lot less toward the wealthy and a lot more toward sort of the middle class and the underclass, to make the society sort of more unequal because they want to sort of encapsulate a larger proportion of society, right? And we do find this statistically. We find that proportional representation in high district magnitude nations tend to spend, when you're not sort of controlling for other variables, it's a huge difference, right? 8% more of their GDP goes to redistributive and welfare spending. And then when you do control for other variables, it's still 2 to 3% more of their total GDP goes to redistributive welfare spending than in single member districts like the United States, England, etc., which tend to be far more sort of low tax, low service nations, right? Whereas PR systems tend to be more higher tax, higher redistribution nations. Okay. What is the indirect effect on the overall size of government spending? Um, so, uh, Theoretically, at least, we would think that coalition governments should tend to have higher budgetary spending. They're going to spend more of their GDP. They're going to be more likely to run deficits, right? And this is because there's so many parties sort of in their coalition government that they have less control over who gets what. There's more log rolling, right? This like I'll promise you this if you promise me that. Um, there's more redistribution and welfare policies. And more of the parties sort of have a veto over the budgetary process, whereas in the United States, it's generally just one party and the president. Whereas in a coalition government, you might have four or five parties all sort of rolled into a coalition, and now they all have to agree on some budget before it gets passed. And so they all have different incentives, and they all have different things that they want out of the budget, right? And so we do find actually that proportional representation systems, and especially coalition systems, tend to spend more than single member districts by about 5% of GDP, which is quite a lot, right? Um, Now, they do mention, and there's some good research on this, however, that some of that may be attributable to ideology, and we find that more PR systems tend to have center left governments, whereas more SMD systems tend to have more right wing governments. So, like the United States and Brazil are far more right wing than sort of mainland Europe, as is Britain, or England, excuse me. And so there may be some, left wing policy tends to be more redistributive anyway, correct? And so some of this 5% that they're suggesting of GDP difference between PR and SMD systems may be attributable to sort of the governments that get elected under these systems, right? And we also find that SMD systems tend to benefit wealthier candidates and donors than PR systems, right? And this tends to lead to more conservative policies, as we've seen. Part 4.3 focuses on budget deficits, and it's kind of uh, what would you say, analogous to the above section that we just talked about. But PR systems not only are likely to have bigger budgets, but they're also more likely to have bigger budget deficits. Um, and we find that statistically as well as theoretically. Why is this? One of the problems is the tragedy of the commons, right? When you have a whole lot of people vying for, okay, tragedy of the commons, I should explain. They call it the common pool problem, but most economists and political scientists call it the tragedy of the commons. The idea here is that, say, you have a pasture or you have fishing resources, sort of hypothesize either one. Um, it's a resource that is finite, right? Whether it's grassland or whether it's a fishing resource, it's finite, and only so much either sort of munching by cows or fishing by fishermen can be sustained before the resource is completely drained and destroyed. Um, and so the problem is coming up with some limits or checks and balances or some semblance of a government, whatever it is, to ensure that the tragedy of the commons does not occur, right? And this is why they put limits on fishing, and this is why they put limits on grazing, and things of that sort, right? Um, and so the tragedy of the commons is a lot more likely when you have a lot of parties vying for control of the budget. Um, and those parties are less likely to sort of take in future economic and tax burden problems and deficits, because of this tragedy of the commons, because they can't sort of get over the collective action problem that is entailed with having so many parties involved. And so PR systems, because they have so many sort of veto players in their budgetary process, are likely to run deficits. And finally, PR systems are also um, more prone to sort of exogenous shocks like elections, because if a prime minister or a coalition government has sort of a vote of no confidence, right? They can call an immediate re-election and throw the government out and have to rebuild a coalition. And so, a country like Italy in the 2000s was disastrous for this. They would repeatedly put a government together. It would take them months and months. The government would fall apart within weeks. They'd hold another really expensive election across the nation. They'd spend months trying to build a coalition. It would fall apart in weeks. And this happened over and over and over and over. And the Italian government sort of fell apart, and the Italian economy sort of fell apart. And their budget just ran wild, right? And so this is sort of the problem that happens with this tragedy of the common, with so many parties vying for control of budget. Whereas if there's only one party controlling the budget, like the president's office, it's a lot easier to keep the budget deficit in control. And we find this statistically, right? Um, uh, PR systems tend to have about a 1 to 2% higher budget deficit relative to GDP on a yearly basis than single member district systems. And we also find that proportional representation systems don't really react well to shocks, right? They're just as likely to sort of increase spending during a bad period, right? Say you have a recession or a depression, or like COVID hits, and we see all this injection of government money into the system. But the problem is, in the United States and other single member district systems, they are able to sort of pare that spending back over time, whereas PR systems don't do that. And so they really tend to run these really high budgets and deficit systems. All right, that's all I've got for you today. This was a really complicated chapter, but there was a lot of good information here. So, I think that the main thing here is that it's impossible to build a perfect electoral system, right? You either have sort of responsiveness to the citizens and accountability, or you have high levels of representation, but it's hard to do both. And there are a lot of sort of unconsidered um, um, sort of effects that these electoral systems can have on your society, both sort of from accountability and a responsibility perspective, but also on budgets and things of that sort. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you for the last chapter in Unit 1, which will be actually Chapter 5. So we're going to talk about income distribution by John Londegren from Princeton. So I'll see you for the next one. Have a great day and stay safe out there.